The last thing Cornelius Washington ever expected to feel, sitting inside a house worth $2.4 million, surrounded by everything he had spent 40 years building, was lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from an empty room on a Friday night. Not the surface kind that fades when someone turns on the television or calls from down the hall. This was something older and heavier, the kind that hums beneath a full table at Thanksgiving. The kind that walks with you from room to room even when your wife is downstairs, your son's cars are parked crooked in the driveway, and your daughter's perfume still drifts through the hallways like a memory trying to become real. It was the loneliness of a man who had built a life large enough to hold everyone he loved, and was no longer sure, standing in the middle of it, in whether anyone was actually living there with him. He was sitting in the leather chair by the study window, the same chair he'd owned since the company was just 2 delivery vans, a rented desk, and the kind of faith that only makes sense in hindsight. The chair had been reupholstered twice. The window behind it had been replaced once after a storm. Cornelius had never considered getting rid of it. Some things you keep not because they're beautiful, but because they were there when you were becoming who you are. He held a framed photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. It was from 1998. A backyard birthday party for his youngest, Amara. His wife Loretta had her head thrown back, laughing at something off camera, her teeth bright, her whole body given over to the moment. His oldest, Marcus, was 8, gap-toothed, grinning, unself-conscious in the way children are before the world starts teaching them to perform themselves. Jerome was 6, squinting at the camera with a suspicion that even then struck Cornelius as funny. Simone was 4, her arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit she would carry everywhere for another 2 years. And Amara, just turned 2, was perched on Cornelius's knee like she had always lived there and intended to stay. He set the photograph down. He was 67 years old. His children were adults with their own lives, their own credit card debt, their own opinions about what he should do with his money and his time. Loretta still shared his last name and, most nights, his roof, though the warmth between them had cooled into something polite and manageable. Kind the way a marriage sometimes does when 2 people stay together more from habit than from fire. And the company, Washington Group Holdings, which now spanned logistics, real estate, and property management across 3 states, ran well enough that Cornelius sometimes felt more like a figurehead than a founder. He sat in that chair and asked himself a question he had never quite allowed himself to ask directly before. Who would stay? If I could not give them anything, if the money dried up tomorrow, if the company was gone, if all that remained was a sick old man in a room, who would be there? He thought he knew the answer. He was afraid he knew the answer. He picked up his phone. "Calvin," he said when his attorney answered, "I need to see you and Sandra tonight. My house, 9 o'clock. He paused. "No, nothing's wrong. Something's about to happen, but nothing's wrong. Bring that bourbon I know you have in your office." Calvin Reeves had been Cornelius's attorney for 22 years. He was a methodical man, the kind who thought 3 moves ahead and spoke in complete sentences. And he had the particular gift of making extraordinary things sound manageable. Dr. Sandra Okafor had been Cornelius's physician for 15 years. They had met at a charity gala, discovered they had both grown up poor in the South, and become the kind of friends who could call each other at any hour and be honest about things they wouldn't say to anyone else. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Calvin set the bourbon on the side table. Dr. Okafor sat in the wingback chair across from Cornelius and folded her hands and waited. She and Cornelius told them what he wanted to do. He told them about the loneliness first, about the photograph, about the question he had been asking himself for months. He told them that he was not looking for sympathy and he was not in crisis. He was looking for information, the way you look for information when you need to make a decision that matters, and there is no clean way to get it. "I want to disappear," he said. "Not literally. I want to fake a diagnosis. Something serious enough that no one can ignore it. Terminal. I want to see what happens in this family when they believe the clock is running, when they think I can't protect myself or my assets anymore. I want to see their hearts." Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cornelius, that is an extraordinary thing to do to people you love." "I know. The grief alone, I know." He looked at her steadily. "Sandra, I've watched this family for 3 years. I've watched my son treat my company like it's his retirement account. I've watched my wife look at me like I'm furniture. I've watched my children visit less and less, and I've told myself it's just the busyness of life. It's just what happens when people get older. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm a paranoid old man who doesn't appreciate what he has. He paused. But I need to know for certain, and this is the only way I know how. Calvin turned the bourbon glass in his hands. If we're going to do this, he said at last, we need to protect your assets first. I'll move half your liquid funds into a secondary holding company tonight. New accounts? What new signatories? Well, only me. If anyone tries to sell anything, I'll have intercept buyers ready. Shell companies. We can recover everything. And the company? I'll have monitoring in place. Any decision over a certain dollar amount triggers a review. No contract gets signed without my sign-off, even if Marcus thinks he has the authority. Cornelius nodded. Sandra? Dr. Okafor exhaled slowly. I will deliver the diagnosis, she said. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Aggressive progression, 6 to 8 months. She met his eyes. But I want you to understand something, Cornelius. What you will learn from this test, whatever it is, you will have to carry it. Some knowledge changes things permanently. I know, he said. That's why I need it. Before he went to bed that night, Sir Cornelius installed 3 small CCTV cameras in his bedroom. One aimed at the door, one at the window, one at the visitor's chair beside his nightstand. He lay in the dark for a long time before he slept. He started performing the illness 3 days before Dr. Okafor came to deliver the news. He needed the cough to already be established. Deep, rattling, the kind of sound that makes people's faces change. He stopped eating full meals, pushed food around his plate, let himself look drawn. He moved slowly through the house, one hand trailing along walls, pausing at the top of the stairs. He went to bed earlier. He stopped going to the office. Loretta noticed first, in the detached way she noticed most things that had to do with him. You catching something? She asked one morning, not looking up from her phone. She'd probably just tired, he said. Amara noticed differently. She came home from work. She was a project manager at a development firm, capable and driven, the one who had refused his money when she graduated college and built her own portfolio from scratch, and found him in the kitchen looking drawn and still. She stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment before she said, Daddy, what's wrong? Nothing, baby girl. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, like she was reading something behind the words. Okay, she said, but I'm making dinner tonight. Sit down. He sat down. She made his mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings from memory, and he ate 2 bowls, and she watched him the whole time with something careful in her eyes. He felt a stab of guilt so sharp it almost undid the whole plan. Almost. When Dr. Okafor came, the whole family was assembled by some coincidence or some instinct that made Cornelius wonder, briefly, if they already knew something was wrong. Marcus was there with his wife Kezia, who wore a sympathetic expression she had clearly practiced. Jerome had driven over, still in the clothes he wore to his accounting firm. Simone was on the couch with her sunglasses pushed up into her locks, playing the role of casually present. Loretta sat in the center of the room like she was holding court. Amara sat beside her father. Dr. Okafor delivered the diagnosis in the quiet, precise way that doctors learn when they have to say hard things regularly. She used the right words in the right order with the right silences between them, and she watched the room change. Now, Amara made a sound that was not a word and took both of Cornelius's hands in hers. That was the moment, that single gesture, that instinctive reaching, when Cornelius felt the weight of what he had set in motion. Not doubt exactly, certainty. Certainty that the answer to his question was already standing right beside him, but that he needed to see the rest, needed the full picture, before he could act on what he knew. So he stayed in his chair and looked appropriately frightened and let the world believe what it believed. Jerome was the first to speak practically. Options, he said, pulling out his phone. Second opinions, clinical trials. What are we looking at here? For a moment, a real, warm moment, Cornelius felt something generous toward his second son. That moment passed within a week. The first 2 weeks were tender, and Cornelius was careful to take note of every act of kindness, no matter how small. Marcus brought food twice, catered, expensive, in containers that would have looked better as props than meals. But still, Jerome came by almost every day, asked real questions, sat on the edge of the bed and talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. He told his father about a problem he was having at work, and then he said, "What would you do?" And the question, so ordinary, so unguarded, made Cornelius feel something he had almost forgotten. Useful, known. The kind of known that comes from a child who still, in some buried part of themselves, believes their parent has answers. Simone visited in the evenings, told stories about work and friends and the small comedies of ordinary life. And she sat beside him on the bed and let him hold her hand. And Cornelius held it and thought, this is still in here. This is still real. Whatever fear and greed live in her, this is in here too. Loretta, to her credit, made his meals herself for the first 4 days. She stood in the kitchen, which she rarely used, and cooked the way she had cooked when they were young and broke and had nothing except each other in the future. She brought the food upstairs and set it on the tray table beside the bed and said, "Eat, Cornelius. You need your strength." She didn't stay long, but she came. Cornelius ate everything she brought. He thought about what it meant that she still knew how to do this, that after everything, she still came to his room with a bowl of something warm. He filed it alongside everything else he was learning. Then, at precisely the point when a real diagnosis would start to sink in, when the shock wears off and the practical reality sets in, things began to change. Marcus stopped coming after the 10th day. Too much at work, Kezia said. Jerome's visits shortened, then spaced further apart. Simone's evening check-ins became texts. Thinking of you, heart emoji, then nothing for days. Loretta moved to the guest room in the second week. "So I don't disturb your sleep, darling," and stopped entering his room unless she had a reason. The house grew quiet in the particular way of a place that has decided something. Amara was the one who stayed. She rearranged her schedule without announcing it. She came home earlier, brought breakfast upstairs every morning, sat beside him in the evenings. When he coughed, the deep, why-you-rattling performance he had perfected, she rubbed slow circles on his back and said nothing, because she understood that sometimes the presence was the thing, not the words. One night she fell asleep in the chair beside his bed. Cornelius lay in the dark watching her sleep and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Known, not celebrated or appreciated or leveraged, just known. The way you feel known by someone who has watched you closely enough to understand you without requiring you to explain yourself. He thought, this is what I built everything for. This right here. And then he thought, but I need to see the rest. The change came in the 4th week, and it did not arrive slowly. Calvin called on a Tuesday evening, after a day Cornelius had spent mostly in bed, genuinely exhausted from the sustained performance of illness. "The Marcus held a meeting at the office today," Calvin said. "I thought you should hear it directly." Cornelius sat up. "Tell me." Marcus had gone into Washington Group Holdings with the energy of a man who had already, in his mind, taken possession of something. He spoke to the board about transition planning, about leadership continuity, about protecting the company during a period of, and this was the phrase that lodged itself in Cornelius's chest, operational uncertainty. He had proposed, with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance, that he step into an executive role. Temporary, he said, just until things were clearer. Reginald Osei had been with the company for 19 years. He had started as a route driver when the business was still just 2 vans, and he had grown with it, been trusted with it. Anar had taken a pay cut during the hard years without complaint. He raised his hand and said carefully and respectfully that he thought this decision ought to come from Mr. Washington himself, that it seemed premature to make structural changes while the man was still living. Marcus had said Reginald's name the way people say a warning. The meeting had proceeded. That evening, lying in the dark, Cornelius asked Calvin about Jerome and Simone. Jerome had attended a separate meeting with the management company that handled the Brooklyn apartment building. 12 units, steady income, 30 years of loyal tenants. He had presented documents claiming power of attorney. He did not have power of attorney. Calvin had anticipated this. His people were already in position. When the management company called to verify, Calvin intercepted the transaction, deployed a shell buyer, and took possession of the deed on Cornelius's behalf. Jerome walked away thinking he had converted the building into cash. He had sold it to Cornelius. As for Simone, she had not attempted to move any assets directly. What she had done, Calvin said carefully, was consult a luxury real estate broker about the value of the Washington family home. Not to list it, not yet, just to understand the numbers. Cornelius was quiet for a long time after Calvin finished. "And Loretta?" he asked. Calvin hesitated in the particular way of a man who wishes he were somewhere else. "There's something I need to tell you. I want to tell you in person." He came over the next morning. He sat across from Cornelius, who was already sitting up in bed. And he said it plainly because there was no other way to say it. Loretta had been seen twice at the Meridian Hotel in Midtown. The man's name was Desmond Archer, 41, ran a fitness studio in Chelsea. The first time could have been innocent. The second time was not. Cornelius received this information the way he had learned, over decades of business, to receive news that changed things. He let it land. He did not flinch away from it, and he gave himself time before he responded. "Thank you," he said. "Cornelius." "Thank you, Calvin. I'll be in touch." After Calvin left, he sat in the quiet for a long time. He was not surprised exactly. There had been distances between them for years, absences that were never quite explained. A quality to Loretta's restlessness that he had chosen, perhaps willfully, not to examine too closely. But there is a difference between sensing something and knowing it, between looking away and having the thing placed directly in front of you. He felt grief, real grief, the slow and substantial kind. And then he felt something clarify beneath the grief. Not anger, not betrayal in its bitter form, but a clear-eyed recognition of what was true and what he now had to do with it. He looked at the CCTV monitor in his bedside drawer for a long time. Then he closed it and went back to waiting. Marcus moved into the company the way a man moves into a house he believes he has inherited. He rearranged the furniture first. Within a week, he had dismissed Reginald Osei, whose 19 years apparently counted for nothing against the inconvenience of his honesty. He had also let go of 3 other long-term employees, people who had been with Cornelius since before Marcus was old enough to understand what a company was, and replaced them with younger associates from his networking circles, people who were polished and agreeable and had no particular investment in the company's history or values. He launched something he called Washington Luxe, a premium lifestyle brand, apparel, accessories, fragrance. He announced it with a presentation and a budget that would have given Cornelius a headache under any circumstances. He hired consultants. He rented billboard space. He ordered inventory. None of it was approved by the board. None of it was run past Calvin. When Jerome discovered what Marcus was doing with the company funds, he arrived at the office in a fury and confronted his brother in front of the staff. The exchange, according to people who witnessed it, escalated from an argument to a screaming match to something physical that required 2 people to intervene. Jerome left. Marcus stayed, straightening his jacket, and returned to his desk. Jerome, nursing his anger, went directly to Brooklyn. The building transaction, as Calvin had already managed, produced documents Jerome believed were real. That same week, Simone's real estate consultation produced a valuation she shared, apparently casually, with her mother over lunch. Loretta had nodded and said, "Good to know." Calvin reported this to Cornelius. Cornelius said, "They're moving faster than I expected." There was an evening, the 43rd day, Cornelius had started counting, when he heard something that cut differently than any of the asset movements. He had gotten up slowly, performing for no one, just because he needed to move, and he had made his way to the hallway outside the study. Below in the living room, his sons were talking, not arguing. That was what stopped him on the stairs. They were laughing. It was the loose, unguarded kind of laughter that happens when people feel at home, when they've forgotten that anything is watching. Marcus was talking about the Flatiron space, a new headquarters, the expansion of Washington Luxe. His voice had the easy confidence of someone describing a kingdom he has already taken ownership of. "The old staff has to go eventually," he said, not unkindly, "the way you describe an inevitability. Can't keep people around who were loyal to someone else's vision." Jerome said something Cornelius couldn't make out. Marcus laughed again. "Dad built what he built," Marcus said, "but we're not going backwards." Cornelius stood on the stairs with one hand on the wall and listened. He was not angry. He was something sadder than angry. He was finished with hoping. The last small part of him that had believed Marcus might yet surprise him was standing in that hallway, and it was very quiet, and it was letting go. He went back upstairs. He sat in the chair by the window. The CCTV monitor sat in his bedside drawer, recording the room, recording the silence. He didn't open it. Loretta brought Desmond into the house on a Wednesday morning. She introduced him to the family at breakfast. Jerome was there. Simone was there. Iramara had already left for work and said he was a wellness consultant she had engaged to help the family manage the stress of the current situation. He was handsome and carefully dressed, and he shook hands with the practiced warmth of someone who was used to being well received. He would be staying in the guest suite at the East Wing. Jerome raised an eyebrow. Simone looked between her mother and Desmond with an expression she quickly adjusted. Marcus, when he heard about it later from Kezia, said wild and moved on. Amara came home at 6 and found Desmond in the kitchen, making himself coffee with the ease of someone who had already decided this was his kitchen. She stood in the doorway for a moment, very still, and then she went upstairs. She knocked on her father's door. She sat down on the edge of the bed. "Daddy," she said, as she looked at her hands. He waited. He knew what was coming. "Mama brought a man into the house," she said. "She said he's a consultant." She paused. "I don't think he's a consultant." He looked at his daughter for a long time. "I know," he said. She looked up sharply. "You know?" "Yes." "For how long?" "A while." Amara stared at him. He could see her working through it. The timeline. What it meant that he'd known and said nothing. What it cost him to lie in this room pretending and knowing. He watched something in her face shift from confusion into a deep protective grief on his behalf. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said. Her voice was soft and certain. "Don't be." He took her hand. "It's not yours to be sorry for." She held his hand for a while and didn't say anything else. Outside, the sound of Desmond's voice drifted up from below, confident, casual, fully at home in someone else's house. Cornelius looked at the window. "I think it's almost time," he said, mostly to himself. It was Amara who made the decision, and she made it the morning she came downstairs and found Desmond eating breakfast in her father's chair. Not a guest chair, not a neutral chair. The specific chair that had been Cornelius Washington's place at his own table for the better part of 3 decades. The chair nobody sat in when he was home because it was his, just understood, part of the invisible grammar of the house. Desmond was in it, eating eggs. Loretta was at the counter refilling his orange juice. Amara stood in the kitchen doorway. She stood there for 10 seconds. She counted. Oui, because counting kept her voice from doing things she would regret. And then she turned around and went back upstairs. She packed her father's bag. She called Calvin and told him the plan and asked him what she needed to know. She did not call Marcus, did not call Jerome, did not knock on Simone's door. She left a note on the kitchen counter, taking Daddy somewhere to rest, back when he's ready. By 7 in the morning, before anyone else was awake, she had her father in the car and they were gone. They drove south. Amara took the first 6 hours, through New Jersey, through the throat of Philadelphia, through the long green corridor of Maryland and Virginia, while Cornelius sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change, and felt for the first time in 7 weeks like himself. Not the version of himself he'd been performing, not the weakened, coughing, carefully diminished thing he had built to serve a purpose. Himself. Cornelius James Washington, age 67, son of Estelle and Raymond, born in Valdosta, Georgia, on a Tuesday morning in November. The man who had driven a van full of other people's freight at 5 in the morning to pay for a business license. The man who had sent his children to the best schools and never once told them what he'd given up to do it. The man who had built something real from nothing, which meant he understood what things were worth. He sat in the passenger seat and breathed. Around the Virginia-North Carolina border, Amara let the car fall into a long silence. They had been talking on and off. Safely, about logistics, about the plan, went about what Calvin was monitoring, and now the talking had run out, and there was just the road and the trees and the particular quiet of 2 people who know each other well enough to share silence without discomfort. Amara said, "Daddy, mm, are you really sick?" He heard the question land and felt its weight. It was not an accusation. It was a door, opened carefully by someone who had been watching too closely for too long and had arrived at a conclusion she needed him to confirm or deny. He said, "What made you ask that?" "The way you drove," she said. "Those last 3 hours. You held the wheel like a man who drives, not like a sick man, not like someone performing not being sick." She glanced at him. "You were just driving." Cornelius looked at the road for a long time. "No," he said. "I'm not sick." He told her everything. He started with the photograph, the 1998 picture, the birthday party, the question it had made him ask himself. And he went through all of it. The plan, the cameras, Calvin's intercepts, what Marcus had done to the company, what Jerome had done to the building, what Simone had been arranging quietly on the side, what Loretta had done while he lay in his room pretending to be unable to defend himself. He did not spare himself in the telling. He said, "I was afraid. I could not find another way to see the truth. And maybe that says something about me too, about the distance I let grow in this family, about the things I didn't say when I should have said them, about the years I assumed love without tending to it." Amara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she drove in silence for almost a mile. Then she said, "Was I part of it?" "No." The word came immediately without thought, because it was simply true. "You were never the experiment, Amara. You were the reason I needed the truth. I needed to know if what I saw in you was real, if the love you showed me was genuine, or if I had been fooling myself about everything in this family. I needed proof that I hadn't simply invented one good child in my grief." She was quiet again, and then, softly, unexpectedly, she laughed. A small, tired, complicated laugh. "Daddy," she said, "you could have just talked to me. Would you have believed what I was afraid of?" She thought about it honestly. The trees went by. "No," she said. "Probably not," he nodded. "When that's why I needed to see it." The Washington family home in Valdosta had belonged to Cornelius's cousin Roberta for the past decade, since his mother Estelle died. Roberta kept the garden the way Estelle had kept it. Marigolds along the front walk, a vegetable plot in the back, two large shade trees that were older than anyone could say. She made the same potato salad at every gathering and called Cornelius corny the way nobody else did anymore. And she kept a photograph of Estelle on the mantle that she talked to sometimes, which Cornelius had always found both eccentric and deeply correct. When the car turned onto the street and Roberta came out onto the porch before they had cut the engine, Cornelius felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the particular warmth of being in a place that knew him before he was anything. "Lord have mercy," Roberta said. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the weight he had lost, the careful way he moved, all the accumulated evidence of his performance. And her face did what the faces of people who love you actually do, which is to change. "Come inside right now," she said. "Both of you, right now." Word moved through the community the way it does in small southern towns. Fast and caring, carried on phone calls and front porch conversations, and the particular network of church ladies who have kept track of everyone's children and grandchildren for 50 years. By the next morning, people were coming to the house. What Thomas Beaumont had owned the barbershop on Magnolia Street for 3 decades. Cornelius had lent him money 30 years ago, quietly refusing repayment, refusing even acknowledgement, when a bad lease negotiation had nearly closed the place. Thomas showed up with his wife and his grown son and a covered dish big enough to feed 10 people. He shook Cornelius's hand with both of his and held on. "I just needed to see your face," he said. That was all. Gloria Hendricks had been a single mother with 2 jobs and a nursing school acceptance letter, and no way to pay for it when Cornelius found out about her situation through a mutual friend and wrote a check she had not asked for. She was 52 now, a charge nurse at the county hospital with 3 children and a granddaughter who called her Mimi. She sat with Cornelius for 2 hours and told him all of this, the whole forward story of what one act of generosity had set in motion. And she said, "I have prayed for you every week for 20 years, not because I owe you, because you are worth praying for." An elder named Brother Harrison, who had known Cornelius's father, brought a Bible and a bottle of water from his church as well, and read a verse about returning home and finding yourself still known. It went on like this, for days. People who had received from Cornelius came to give something back, even if what they had to give was only presents. Old friends came who owed him nothing, who had simply been fond of him and thought he should know it. Children of people he had helped came because their parents had told them the story often enough that they felt they knew him. Amara sat on the porch steps each morning watching all of this and felt something deep and rearranging happen in her understanding of her father. She had known he was generous. She had not understood the scale of it, not the financial scale, but the human scale, the number of lives that had been quietly steadied by his choices. She thought about the house in New York, about Marcus in the boardroom, and Jerome with his false documents and Simone's real estate research, about Desmond in her father's chair, and then she looked at Thomas and Gloria and Brother Harrison and the rotating company of people who loved Cornelius Washington, not for what he could give them, but for what he had already, years ago, chosen to be. On the third night, Roberta sat with Cornelius on the back porch after Amara had gone to bed. She brought a pitcher of sweet tea and 2 glasses and set them on the small wooden table between the chairs, and they sat in the Georgia dark for a long time before either of them spoke. "You gonna tell me what's really going on?" Roberta said finally. He had already decided on the drive down that if Roberta asked directly, he would tell her the truth. She was family in the deep sense, not just blood, but the kind of person who had always known him without agenda, without expectation, without wanting anything from him except his company. He told her. She listened without interrupting. Her face was still in the dark, her hands folded around her glass of sweet tea. When he finished, the night sounds went on around them. Crickets, a car somewhere on the next street, the soft percussion of the trees. Roberta said. "Say what you're thinking." "I'm thinking that you are your daddy's son." She turned to look at him. Raymond Washington would have done the exact same thing. Quiet man, proud man, couldn't ask for what he needed, so he found another way to find out if it was there. She paused. He was wrong to do it too, by the way. Cornelius smiled despite himself. "But I understand it," she said. "I understand why a man who has given everything needs to know before he goes, if any of it mattered to the people he gave it to." She reached over and patted his arm once. The kind of pat that means I see you, not the kind that means I pity you. The question is what you do with what you found. "That's what I'm working out," he said. "Work it out right," she said. "Be fair and be clear, and don't do it from bitterness. Do it from love, even when love has to be hard." On the 4th evening, sitting on the back porch with Georgia dark all around them and fireflies making their slow, quiet light in the grass, Cornelius said, "I'm ready to go back." Amara looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I know what I know," he said. "I've known it for a while, but I needed to come here first. I needed to remember what I was before I deal with what I am." He looked at the yard, at the marigolds faintly visible in the darkness, at the old shade trees. "My mother used to say, 'Know your roots before you prune the branches.'" "She was right," Amara said. "She was always right." He smiled. "Don't tell her I said that. She'll never let me hear the end of it." Amara laughed, and for a moment they sat in the warmth of that. In the particular sweetness of humor between two people who were about to do something hard. Calvin had everything arranged before the car reached the New York City line. The board members had been notified. The staff, Reginald Osei and the others who had been dismissed, had been contacted. The family had been told only that Cornelius was being brought home. Marcus had texted Jerome that morning. "Might be the end. Be ready." Jerome had not responded. Nobody knew what was coming. The car arrived at noon, the gate opened. Amara drove slowly up the driveway, and she watched the gateman's face through the windshield when he recognized the figure in the passenger seat. Upright, clear-eyed, not coughing, not diminished, not performing anything at all. The gateman's mouth fell open. "Good afternoon, Harris," Cornelius said, someone as he stepped out of the car. Inside, Simone had been on the couch, and she stood up so fast she knocked a throw pillow to the floor. Jerome came around the corner from the kitchen with a mug of coffee and stopped dead. Marcus was halfway down the stairs, one hand on the banister, and he froze there like a man who has seen something his mind cannot immediately categorize. Loretta came from the direction of the East Wing, Desmond's wing, and she stopped in the hallway, one hand reaching for the wall. Cornelius looked at his family. They looked at him. He said, "Good, you're all here." Calvin was already seated in the living room with his leather portfolio when they assembled. Cornelius stood at the center of the room. He did not perform anything. He was simply himself, 67 years old, tired and certain, a man who had built things and was about to decide what they were worth. He told them what he had done, plainly without drama, without anger in his voice, though anyone listening carefully could hear what the steadiness was containing. He explained the diagnosis, the plan, Calvin's role, the cameras. He explained that he had heard everything, that he had seen everything. The room was completely still. He turned to Marcus. He said, "I built that company over 40 years. I built it by trusting people who trusted me. Reginald Osei gave me 19 years of loyalty, and you dismissed him inside of 2 weeks because he asked a reasonable question? You replaced people who knew the roots of what we built with people who care about the surface of it. You made financial decisions with company funds without board approval. You started a venture that failed because you were too rushed and too uninterested in the history of what worked to understand why it would fail." He paused and let Marcus feel the weight of the silence before he continued. "I want to say something else to you, Marcus." He looked at his oldest son, at the jaw that was his own jaw, at the hands that were built like his hands, at the expression of a man bracing himself. "I know you are not a villain. I know you are a man who was afraid. Afraid the company would be lost. Afraid of not having enough. Afraid of being the eldest son who didn't step up when it mattered. I know because I have felt every one of those fears myself. But fear is not an excuse. It is a reason to be more careful, not less. You were less careful than the situation required. And the things you lost in your carelessness, the money, the house, the car, those were your inheritance. They are gone now. Spent." Marcus sat very still. "You will leave the company," Cornelius said, "not because I have stopped loving you, but because trust is not given by birth. It is earned, and you have not yet earned it. If you want to rebuild what is between us, you do that as my son, not as my successor. The door is not closed, but it is no longer open by default." He turned to Jerome. "Jerome," he said, "you sold a building that I planned to give you. You sold it using documents you fabricated. Calvin's people bought it back, and the deed is in my safe. The money you made from that transaction, keep it. Consider it your inheritance. The building is no longer yours to receive. You chose the shortcut over the inheritance. And I can't give you both." Jerome had his eyes closed. "I know you are not a dishonest man by nature," Cornelius said. "I know you made a frightened, greedy decision, and I know you would probably make a different one if you could go back. That is what makes it so sad. You don't get to go back. But you can come forward. If you want to, there is a path back into this family's business. But it starts with you earning it." He turned to Simone. To Simone, he said, "You made phone calls you should not have made while I was allegedly on my deathbed. You did not steal anything. You planned to. I want you to sit with the difference between those two things, because there is less distance between them than you think. And I want you to come back to me when you have understood it. Not with an apology, with a change. Show me what you are capable of. That is all I'm asking." Simone was crying quietly, and she nodded. He looked at Loretta last. He said, "I know about Desmond." The room held itself. He said, "I have known for weeks. I have been lying in a room full of cameras watching everything, and I watched my wife choose someone else while I pretended to be dying. And the truth I have had to sit with is this. We lost each other a long time before this plan. I do not know exactly when, but I know it was not sudden. It was gradual, and we both let it happen, and we never said so. I carry my part in that." Loretta's hand was pressed against her chest. "But I cannot carry what happened in this house," he said. "I cannot look at these walls and not see it. So I am asking you to leave. I will make sure you are taken care of. Financially, illegally, because 40 years together deserves respect. But this marriage is finished. We both know it was finished before I ever set up those cameras. Loretta said his name once. Cornelius. He looked at her. He let her see that he was not angry. He was done. Calvin will arrange everything, he said. You have until the end of the month. The restructuring took 3 weeks. Reginald Osei came back to the company on a Monday morning and found his desk as he had left it, his name on his door, and a handwritten note from Cornelius that said, "Thank you for your 19 years. Thank you for asking the right question in that room. You are not forgotten. I am sorry it took me this long to say so." The other dismissed employees returned. The Washington Lux project was dissolved. Once the contracts Marcus had signed were reviewed one by one, some kept, others unwound at cost. The company was smaller for a few months than it had been, and then it was not smaller, and then it was something better. Steadier, more careful, built on the understanding that growth without integrity was just expansion toward collapse. Amara was named Executive Vice President. She had not expected it. She had been sitting in Calvin's office, reviewing documents, when Cornelius walked in and said simply, "I want you to run the company with me." She had looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Okay, but I'm doing it my way." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She spent the first month learning the company from the inside out. She sat with Reginald for hours asking every question she could think of. She stayed late, came early. He brought food to staff meetings and learned everyone's name and their tenure, and one thing about their lives outside the building. She was not trying to be her father. She was trying to understand the ground he had built on so she could build further. The staff called her Miss Washington, but they said it with warmth. Within 6 months, the company's quarterly numbers were the best they had been in 4 years. Marcus took his settlement and started something of his own. A smaller venture, less grand than his plans had been, but honest in a way that his work at the family company had not been. He called his father once a month. He did not call about business. He called about other things, about his marriage, about his fears, or about questions he had never thought to ask when he was young and certain, and his father was just the man who would always be there. Cornelius took those calls sitting in the leather chair by the study window. Jerome took longer. The path back was uneven and slow, with backsliding and long silences, and one conversation in Cornelius's study that lasted 4 hours and ended with both men looking emptied out and oddly at peace. He never returned to the family company. He built a quieter life. He came to Sunday dinners. Simone did what her father had asked. She showed him, over time, who she could be when she chose to be better than her worst moment. It took the better part of a year. He watched. He noticed. He let her know he noticed. Loretta made her arrangements and moved into a beautiful apartment in a neighborhood she had always liked. Cornelius made sure of that. They were civil in the polished, careful way of people who once knew each other well and now know each other differently. They were not enemies. They were not what they had been. They were something honest, and honest was enough. On a morning in late October, about a year after the test, Cornelius sat in the leather chair by the study window before anyone else in the house was awake. The light was doing what it does in fall, going long and golden, falling through the glass in bars that crossed the floor the way they had crossed it every October for 30 years. The house was quiet. From below, he could hear the faint sounds of Amara moving in the kitchen. She was an early riser, and had been since she was small. The soft percussion of a cabinet, the hiss of the kettle. He had the photograph in his hands, the 1998 one. He looked at it differently now than he had the evening he sat here and asked himself the question that started everything. He did not look at it with longing exactly, or with grief exactly. He looked at it with the feeling of a man who has traveled a long distance and arrived somewhere that required him to leave some things behind. He had lost things. The marriage was gone. The easy belief that his children would simply be who he hoped they were was gone. The comfortable assumption that love, once established, would sustain itself without tending. That was gone too. But something else had come. Something he could not have gotten any other way. He knew that. And he had turned it over many times in the months since the plan ended, asking himself if there had been a different path. A conversation, a direct confrontation, a family meeting where he simply said, "I am afraid. I am getting older. I need to know you love me. He did not believe that conversation would have produced what the test had produced. People do not reveal their hearts in polished, intentional moments. They reveal them in the unguarded ones. In the weeks they believe they are not being watched. He had watched. He had seen. And what he had seen was not only darkness. That was the thing he had not expected. The full picture, when it finally came, contained more light than he had been prepared for. Amara's steadiness, Jerome's eventual willingness to sit down and be honest, Simone's proposal, all those months later, he coming through his study door with real work in it. Marcus's phone calls from Atlanta, unexpected, slightly awkward, full of things a proud man finds hard to say. The way Reginald Osei had come back on that Monday morning and, without anyone asking him to, stayed 2 hours late to brief the junior staff on the history of the company. Not because he was told to, because he wanted them to know. He heard Amara's footsteps on the stairs. She always took them two at a time, had done since she was a teenager, would apparently never stop. And then a knock at the study door. "Come in." She was dressed for the office already, looking more like him than she knew, the same set to the shoulders, the same way of entering a room like she had already measured it. She was carrying a coffee in one hand and a folder of projections in the other. And she stood in the doorway, looking at him with an expression he had grown to love, equal parts businesslike and deeply fond. "Morning," she said. "Morning, baby girl." She crossed the room and set the coffee on the side table where he could reach it. She looked at the photograph in his hands, then at him. She had never asked him about the photograph. She seemed to understand, the way she understood many things about him, that it was his to hold. "Board call in 40 minutes, she said. "I wanted to walk you through the fourth quarter numbers first." She opened the folder. "The Atlanta expansion is tracking ahead of projections. Reginald thinks we can move the timeline up by a quarter if we want. What do you think?" She considered it, genuinely not performing consideration. "I think we move carefully. The bones are right. We don't need to rush." He nodded. "Agreed." She sat across from him and began to walk him through the numbers. Her voice was sure and clear, and she had done her homework, and she did not oversell things or undersell them. She was just honest, just precise, just herself. Outside the window, the October light kept doing what it had always done, arriving, staying as long as it could, asking nothing in return. Cornelius listened to his daughter talk about the future of everything he had built. He thought about Thomas and his barber shop, about Gloria and her nursing degree, and her granddaughter, about the people who had come to Roberta's house in Valdosta with their covered dishes and their prayers, and their simple, uncomplicated love. He thought about Reginald Osei's face on the Monday morning he came back. He thought about Jerome's voice in that 4-hour conversation, cracked open and trying. He thought about Simone, who had shown up at his study door 3 months ago with a business proposal she had prepared herself. Real research, careful numbers, a plan for a mentorship program within the company that she wanted to run, and handed it to him and said, "No favors, just read it." He had read it. It was good. He told her so. He thought about Marcus calling from Atlanta on his birthday, unexpectedly, just to say, "I've been thinking a lot. I wanted you to know I'm thinking about it." He thought about Loretta's apartment, which she had decorated beautifully, which she had told him she loved. A small, honest declaration of something she had wanted for herself for years. He thought about Amara. Amir asleep in the chair beside his bed during the months of the performance, and about the sound of her voice on that highway saying, "You could have just talked to me." He had thought about that a lot. He knew now that he was not innocent in this story. He had held things back, for years, maybe for decades, out of pride or fear or the particular stubbornness of a man who had built everything himself and was not sure how to ask for what he needed. He had expected his family to love him in ways he had never made clear. He had tested them for failings he had partly cultivated through his own silence. That was the hardest thing the test had revealed. Not their failures, but his. Not just the children who had disappointed him, but the father who had not said what he needed to say while he still had the chance. He was saying it now. Well, that was what he had. That was the only inheritance that moved in the right direction. Not from him to them, but between them, freely, while they were all still here to give it. "Daddy," Amara said. She had noticed him looking out the window. "I'm here," he said. "Keep going. I'm listening to every word." She smiled, small, certain, and went back to the numbers. Outside, the October light kept falling. Inside, the house held its people. Cornelius Washington sat in his chair, in his house, with his youngest daughter's voice filling the room with plans for the future of what he had built. And he felt, for the first time perhaps in his entire life, that he had given enough, that he had been enough, that this moment right here was the whole point of the thing. Not the houses, not the company, not the photograph.